welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is a rare ARC review video for my channel. So, obviously that comes with a disclaimer here at the beginning. The White Country by Boston Teran is the book we're covering today, and obviously I did receive an ARC for this book. Thank you to Wildbound PR for providing that for me. In fact, making it my first physical ARC that I've ever had, which is actually really dope. Like, that's kind of cool. New milestone. I'll, at the very least, always remember this book for being my first physical ARC. Like I said, there comes with this video a pretty obvious disclaimer in that the book was sent to me, but I've not been paid or otherwise compensated for my review or my opinion on the book directly. All thoughts expressed in this video are my own and not influenced by any publisher or author or anybody else for that matter. So, The White Country. What is The White Country about? Normally I don't do a what is this book about type of thing, but I feel like it's justified in this case, not just because it's an ARC, but because the concept is a lot of what attracted me to the book in the first place. So I will go ahead and read the first paragraph of the back of the book on here. Set in 1911, a time when Texas is rife with racism and unrest, The White Country follows John Lourdes, the first minority-born agent of the Texas Bureau of Investigation. As Mexico is ravaged by famine and political corruption, thousands of desperate people cross into Texas, igniting a wave of hatred and violence that would echo for generations. The border becomes a lawless land, plagued by bandits, drug smugglers, and hooded vigilantes led by a figure known only as the White Man, with White Man notably in that description being one word, capitalized, so kind of like a title more than, you know, a indistinct or vague term. Reading this description for the book is, like I said, what initially hooked me, not just because it sounded interesting, not just because it sounded like it was a good setting, which it does in my opinion, but because I wanted to see what the specific exploration of the topics therein were going to end up being within the novel. There are plenty of times where you can have a pretty interesting or engaging topic that is covered poorly because of a heavy hand or whatever on the author's part. There's also plenty of other times where you have something that doesn't seem like it would be very interesting, where covered pretty well, it ends up being really good in spite of all odds. Knowing what The White Country was about, I went into this knowing that there could be plenty of places where it could go wrong, where it could be heavy-handed, but I knew with good handling of the topic that I would probably really enjoy it. So how did things end up shaking up for me in the long run? Well, let's talk about that. We'll start off just as I normally do in these reviews with the good of The White Country, and I gotta say probably the thing that sticks out the most to me, having just finished this pretty recently, this morning as of the time of recording this, simple storytelling and pretty much a lack of abject complexity was pretty nice to read in the book. It's not asking a whole lot of you. It's not requiring a whole lot of thought. It's not requiring you to really have to think just to be able to read the book. Coming off of reading something like a Wheel of Time book pretty recently for me, means that my brain is kind of, you know, just a little bit tired from having to keep track of names and specific details that don't seem important, but then eventually end up being important, or trying to recall information that might have been, you know, brought up just a couple of times in recent books, but not being able to exactly peg down what it was that I was needing to remember for the scene that I was remembering or the scene that I was reading in any given moment. That's not to say that Wheel of Time is necessarily super complex, but there is a lot of little stuff going on, and keeping track of all that when reading it at the pace that I've been reading it, it can get pretty complicated. Reading The White Country pretty soon after finishing A Crown of Swords actually ended up being a really, really great refresher, because it is short. It's only 260 pages in the paperback and the hardcover versions, or at least the listings, the online listings for the hardcover version are pretty much identical to the paperback. Only 260 pages in here, and it's got, like I said, pretty simple storytelling. It's not super complex. It's relatively straightforward. There's some things under the surface there that are good, thought-provoking material, but overall, the actual storytelling itself is simple, easy to follow, and I really appreciated that about the book. Maybe it meant at certain times, occasionally, just every once in a while, that certain things didn't always get the full focus that maybe I was hoping that it would all of the time, but that's okay. Being used to reading a bunch of epic fantasy does not mean that anything that isn't that should be so detail-oriented that I feel like I'm literally part of that world, or like the world is like the most immersive thing I could ever possibly imagine. That's not the point of this book, and frankly, that's not the point of most books in most genres that are not science fiction and fantasy. So just being able to have a complete reset, a complete mind shift, something that was doing something different, was really great for me. I overall really appreciated that I didn't have to think too hard about the plot or story just to be able to follow it, or just to be able to put things together. Also, as we kind of discussed kind of in the introduction here, the subject matter of the book is something that could easily be handled very poorly by any given author, but I feel like that Boston Teran handled it generally quite well in The White Country. It was often engaging. The conflicts of the story were never super like in your face or preachy in any way. The antagonists also felt super fleshed out in a way that they could have just been very token, antis of whatever, racists or sexists or whatever. You could have had just bread and butter, cut and dry. These guys are racist, and that's literally all there is to them. No, there's some actual depth to the characters, to the antagonists, like I said, and an exploration of the topics that all of the characters are wrapped in that makes it engaging, that keeps it from being preachy. They had actual stakes associated with them, both in the story and in terms of the character. The author is not just grinding an axe without thought in this book, and he actually takes an approach that respects the readers, and that is very much appreciated. And speaking so much on the actual characters, I felt like all of the characters in the story, especially for something so short, were pretty dynamic and also felt pretty storied, and as if they had actually been living in the story, in this world for a little while. They never really felt like caricatures, nor like they were simply vessels of the plot. They felt like legitimate characters. For such a short book, Boston did a great job with them. Furthermore, the interactions between all of the characters were nearly all very believable. The violence and the shock factor, as well as far as the story itself goes, is exactly appropriate for the type of story that this is and the scale that it is at. None of it is ever overdone. I never felt like it was ever gruesome or exceptionally gross, or even really notably like, just a problem. I never experienced any scene, even the more violent scenes, even the more disturbing scenes in here, never felt over the top or like Boston was just doing something to do something for the shock factor. It felt like it was actually appropriate to the scale of the world and to the story that he was telling. These days, in the 2020s, authors restraining themselves as far as violence and gore, and even sex scenes to that extent. I never felt like I was underwhelmed by the violence in the book, nor did I ever feel like Boston was overindulgent. Kind of on a similar wavelength as well, beyond the violence and that kind of material, there's also the aspect of cursing within books, within just, the general language usage of authors. In the modern day, swearing a lot in books is pretty normal, but there's a lot of cases where that doesn't necessarily feel supernatural. It doesn't feel appropriate sometimes. You'll read a certain curse where it's just like, did you really need to use that word? I would argue that you didn't, and it feels more like the author is just swearing just to swear, like, oh, look, this book swears, versus actually using it to any impactful degree. Impactful is not quite the word I'm looking for there, but I'm having, struggles actually searching for the right one. I felt like the cursing in The White Country was kind of a breath of fresh air, not least because it was pretty sparse. There's very few moments of legitimate swearing occurring in the book, but when it does, it didn't feel super out of place. It's not to say that it felt super earned or really deserved, like, oh yeah, you really should have sworn there. It just never felt like he was being overindulgent, kind of on that same point. Never was really thrown around too much, so even if the random occurrences of it might be a little bit out of place to a certain degree, I was never really offended by it because it wasn't just utilized to no purpose, to no end. It was usually used to emphasize a particular point in dialogue or in the narration, where it felt like, yeah, it would make sense to really actually, hone in on that point, and using a curse word was an effective or an efficient way of doing so. So, no real complaints as far as that is concerned. A lot of what this book is about at the end of the day is kind of being in the center of a conspiracy of sorts, and it's kind of a two-part conspiracy. You have two opposing, not necessarily factions. Faction isn't necessarily the right term, but let's just think of it as that for an example. You have two factions that are kind of combating each other, and there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of potential for violence and drama in between the two. Now let's imagine that you have a character that stands in between them and is sort of like a double agent for both factions, kind of set to do a task and utilizes information as like a, not even a spy, but utilizes information that he gains from both groups by being friends of both sides without necessarily each side knowing it. There's a little bit more to that, but for now that's an okay explanation. That double agent sort of internal conspiracy storyline is a lot of what The White Country follows. I thought it was really, really good. In fact, a lot of this is what makes the book so engaging for much of its runtime, is seeing the development of this, seeing how the main character is able to get through the various type of roadblocks that occur, where and how he goes from each step. He's kind of figuring it out as he goes, and as such, the reader felt like, or at least I felt like as a reader, like I was being taken along for that journey. It was a fun journey, I gotta say. It also feels authentic and genuine. That's really what it comes down to. When I finished the book, I was like, this feels like an actual piece of art. Some books that try to cover topics such as this is covering, sort of social dilemmas, they can definitely feel like they're grinding their axe, as I said before, and Boston is not doing that. Additionally, when you have stories set in the past that are covering topics like this, they can feel pretty metaphorical and like they're just representing some very poorly executed representation of something in the sort of modern day, and oftentimes comes across very bad as such. And I never got that feeling from this one. I was worried about that. I never felt like I, as a reader, was being beaten into submission, nor did the book ever feel like it was trying to be meta about it, so I appreciated all of that. But now we're going to jump into the bad of The White Country, because there are a few things that perhaps I noticed about my reading that maybe bothered me a little bit. A couple of these are just kind of minor nitpicks, so don't take all of these too seriously. The first thing, and what I would say is maybe the most major, actual flaw of the story, the only one that's I'm really able to pin down to any significant degree, and that is I feel like the antagonists, the direct antagonists of the story, should have caught on to what was going on a little bit earlier than they did. I kind of gave you a vague hint of somebody being kind of a middleman between two opposing kind of groups, that basically being what this story is. Again, there's a little bit more to it than that, but it's kind of like the most basic outline of what's going on. There are a handful of moments throughout the story in which said middleman should have absolutely been questioned or caught by the antagonists if they were just thinking for even more than a split second. It took them a lot longer to catch on to kind of what was going on than I feel like fully made sense. It's basically my only real gripe with the actual plot and story of the book as a whole. But beyond being able to suspend my disbelief for this, because I was still able to suspend my disbelief on this one particular fact, beyond it, I really enjoyed the book and thought it was great. That's just the only real thing that I would point at and be we could have done a little bit more there to make that particular aspect more believable, to add just a tiny bit more depth to how those particular relationships work. For a couple of minor nitpicks, I can say that there are times when Boston Teran seems hardly able to use a pronoun sometimes, and this isn't a recurring problem as far as every single character. It's basically just the main character, John Lordy's, and I say the full name there because it occurs with the full name a lot. He's one character where anytime I ever felt like a name was being repeated too often, because if you've read a book, you know, sometimes you can look at when a name is repeated and be like, you could have just used the he or she there, and that would have worked and would have been better for the sentence, because it feels like you're being redundant a little bit sometimes. There are definitely a number of times when Boston feels like he's being redundant with the main character's name, particularly with the main character's name, because like he's the one you're following for the vast majority of the runtime as far as like perspective goes. So to be utilizing and repeating his full name as often as he does at certain points in the book here is like, what are we doing? You could have just used the pronoun. There was no reason to repeat the full name here. And even if you don't, you know, use a he or a him in place of John Lordy's, you could have just said John instead of John Lordy's. Whereas it feels like almost every single time John's name crops up in the standard narration of the book, it is the full name. Like I said, it's kind of a nitpick. It didn't actually really bother me that much. In fact, I hardly noticed most of the time, but sometimes I did notice, and then I would kind of like glance back and look over a full page and be like, okay, yeah, that name's being used a little bit more than maybe it strictly needs to. So it's not a really big repetition issue. It's just kind of a redundancy issue. It's like, okay, we don't quite need it that often, but it doesn't detract from the story, in my opinion. And then the only other complaint that I guess I would give about The White Country, this is a little bit harder for me to give straight-faced, because there's, you know, a other side of this that we'll talk about in just a moment. The White Country, it took about 45 or so pages for it to really actually grab me and hook me. Now that might sound like a long time, and to be fair, it kind of is, but it's not like this is a big book. It's 260 pages, which I guess to a certain degree could almost sound worse. It's just like, oh, you read basically an entire, you know, fifth of the story basically before it really grabbed you. And it's like, it's not quite that cut and dry. I would say the prologue and like the first handful of chapters were a really great introduction to the story and the world, but there was still a portion of that first 40 or 45 pages that struggled to really get its hooks into me. It's fine. It felt like it was playing it a little bit safe at times, with not quite enough meat to it, especially with kind of the writing. The prose in the book is a little bit too utilitarian at times. Like I said, this kind of not being an epic fantasy book means that it's not getting a whole bunch of like descriptions and everything. So you're kind of going from one point to the next. And I would say the first 45 pages of this book felt like maybe it was moving a little bit too quickly for what it should have been, which is ironic because I was saying it took a little bit for it to grip me, but I'm telling you it should have been longer to make it more immersive. Maybe those are contradictory points, but even so, the point is that it took a little bit for The White Country to get going. But in defense of the book, this may have been affected by the fact that I have not read Creed of Violence by the same author. So if you were to look at the hardcover edition of the book on both Goodreads and the Amazon listing of it, the book is titled The White Country, but then in parentheses says Creed of Violence. And Creed of Violence is one of Boston Teran's earlier books. It's a book that features John Lordy's in it, actually. Upon reading the description, that's kind of what I noticed, and is also set a year before this book. So it seems like this might be a sort of quasi-sequel of sorts, where, you know, some characters, location, maybe some certain things are kind of carried over from Creed of Violence into this one. So there may have been some little bit of backstory or something more expositional going on in the beginning of the book that I didn't fully catch on to because I haven't read Creed of Violence, and I didn't know that this wasn't just a straight up standalone going into it. So the fact that the first 50 pages didn't fully hook me could very well just be because of that, where if someone were to read Creed of Violence, or if somebody who's already read that were to pick this up, maybe they wouldn't have any of those issues, would be able to get, you know, more immersed in it a little bit more easily or more quickly, more immediately, however you want to say it. So I definitely grant that that is a possibility. That said, I do think The White Country is a standalone book insofar as it needs to be. Like I said, I haven't read Creed of Violence, so I don't know how connected this is to that book. I don't know how much of the story actually comes through and whether this is an actual sequel of the book. But even if it is, the plot of this book definitely feels self-contained, once you kind of have an idea of what the story is actually doing, you get the task. You have John Lordy's as the main character getting the task of what he's supposed to do when he goes down to Laredo, and you're following that task all the way through. It doesn't feel connected inherently to the plot of a previous story insofar as I felt like I was missing anything. I enjoyed the story a lot. I enjoyed the plot a lot. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't make a point in the earlier section about the general plot and storyline. I was really hooked in it. When I became hooked after those first 50 pages, incredible. I was like kind of on the edge of my seat for most of those last 200 pages. I was really into it. And as the kind of pace of it quickens as you get closer to the end, everything just kind of worked for me overall. So even though it did have a little bit of a slower start hooking me, which could very well just be because I haven't read Creative Violence, I don't know, once I was hooked about a sixth of the way through the book, definitely by a fifth of the way through the book, I was in, and I was in it for the long haul, and I really, really enjoyed myself. But for the ugly of the White Country, let's talk about kind of that potential worry, some of that, the topic that the book is covering, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. Just, there are going to be some people who heard that description or read the description from the back of the book and be like, that's probably going to suck because the author's probably not going to handle that topic very well. And I totally understand why somebody might feel that way. So if you're kind of off-put by that, I don't think you should necessarily write the book off because of it, because I think Boston handled all of that quite well. But I definitely understand why covering the topics that Boston does in the White Country might off-put some potential readers. Given the setting, the time period, the topic as a whole, this definitely could have been terrible. I empathize with that. It could have come off as very browbeating, very pandering, preachy, lacking in subtlety even. I found I was really intrigued by the premise, but definitely prepared for the worst. Like, I was seriously going into this prepared for all of that material to be covered very poorly, despite my interest in the topic being explored well. So when it turned out being really good and really engaging, especially after those first 40 or so pages, I was very pleasantly surprised. I was super into that. As a way to hammer this point home for those of you maybe still on the fence watching this video, only a handful of moments, a small handful of moments in the book delve towards slight preachiness. And when I say slight preachiness, I mean slight. It's like you read a sentence, it's just like, okay, that sentence could have been rewritten to deliver that point a little bit more subtly, and that is the only thing that you would have needed to change about a sequence or the sentence or whatever. It's just like reword that a little bit and then you don't have any problem. Definitely a lack of super preachy moments in the book, which was the one thing that I was most worried about this going into it, was that it would just be really unbearable to read because of an author grinding his axe. He doesn't grind his axe, and I do really want to make that point loud and clear. Heck, one of the instances of this slight preachiness, quote unquote, was kind of in a character conversation between characters where it didn't necessarily not make sense for that character to feel that way or to say what they did. So any preachiness that it might have felt like coming off of the page from the author, it's like, that could very well just be the character. Maybe I'm just overreacting type of thing. And again, none of it was ever offensive. None of it was ever so serious that I was taken out of the story. So for a recommendation of The White Country, now that this review has been way longer than I intended for it to be, I do recommend The White Country, broadly speaking. If you're not into Western at all, it might be a tough sell because the Western vibe alongside, the kind of concept is a lot of what makes this book what it is. It is the setting, it is the historicity of it, which, speaking on a historicity topic, feels like real world. It incorporates real world events from history around the time. In fact, it mentions a tornado in Laredo from 1905 within the book. So, a reference to actual event in history doesn't necessarily mean it's historical fiction per se, but it's definitely a historical Western. So if you're not into Western at all, you probably aren't going to click with this, and it's probably not going to work for you. But if you are really into the idea of this sort of conspiracy double agent type of plot that's going on, I thought this was quite engaging, and it might be able to make you pull through a setting or vibe that maybe you don't always jive with the rest of the time. I can't say whether the creative violence is necessary for the White Country in order to understand it, beyond the fact that I don't think it was, because again, I think the story is standalone enough to totally work as it is, even if the setup took a little bit longer to really come into something that got its hooks into me than I maybe would have liked. But again, by the time it did get its hooks into me, it was great. The sort of middle conspiracy plot development kept me on my toes the entire way through, and I loved that. So yeah, that is basically how I feel about The White Country. Sorry about this review being a little bit rougher than typical. If you are interested in checking out The White Country, I unfortunately gotta say I'm actually not fully sure on the release date for this one. There's some complications with this. The back of my ARC that I have here says that the published date is March 11th of this year. And I was also told in the corroborations with the promoter about when the book would be releasing, which was March 11th, and the author's website also says March 11th on it. But this book, at least on Amazon, the digital versions of this say it releases on March 17th. And the hardcover version says it's releasing on the 25th. I don't know exactly why those date discrepancies are there. So at the time of this video's release on March 11th, I don't know if this book is actually properly available, like I was kind of under the impression that it would be, or if you might still have to like pre-order something in order for it to work right. But yeah, so a little bit of complication there. I'm under the impression it's supposed to release today on the 11th, but it might be a couple of weeks before any given format that you might be looking for is actually out. So I can't confirm either way because I'm recording this several days before it actually comes out, unfortunately. But I assume the book is available right now, at least it should be. But even if it's not, it should be in the next couple weeks at the very least. So that is kind of an unfortunate situation to be in, but it should definitely be out today. Either way, thank you once again to Wildbound PR for providing me the ARC for this book. I had a good time with it, and I hope anybody who's interested in checking it out will give it a shot because I think it was pretty good. Otherwise, for now, I have been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.